Hello again, and welcome to our next module here in our class. Here we're looking at chapter 7 in our book of Happiness and the Christian Moral Life. And in this chapter, Waddell is focusing on the concept of freedom, right? And freedom specifically as it's understood in a Catholic anthropology and in natural law, right? And I think, as with most of the other chapters so far, he does a really nice job actually of explaining freedom. So I don't feel like there's a lot that we need to go in and correct or clarify or critique. I think he does a pretty nice job of explaining the traditional position and also kind of why it runs counter to a lot of what our society says about the human person and about freedom. I just want to point out, emphasize a couple of things for our consideration as we keep progressing in the book and in our class, and as we build towards looking at some more specific issues. But I think one of the things we're going to see here in this chapter is that we're really starting to get kind of some real detail and substance to an understanding of the human person in Catholic tradition and in natural law, right? That we're really getting to um, some of the key attributes of that understanding and how it differs from more popular views of the human person, because there is this really significant difference in how we think about what it means to be free, right? And we've talked a little bit in recent modules about some of the particular aspects of American culture and how those some of our tendencies can create certain problems when we go to think about natural law or morality, particularly when we look at individualism or our emphasis on capitalism and profit, that there are at least some tensions, if not contradictions, between some of those values and the values that we get in a traditional natural law account of how we should live. And there are similar, I think, tensions, issues when we turn to this subject of freedom, right? Because as Waddell explains, when we talk about freedom, typically in an American context, we are really emphasizing the sort of negative freedom, right? A freedom from compulsion, right? So this means that there aren't outside forces kind of compelling us to act in certain ways, right? And so the freedom that we tend to emphasize in terms of American freedom is that kind, right? We value a society where people aren't constrained in how they choose to live their lives, and that we offer as much freedom as possible, right? And this kind of ties in with a whole host of issues in American politics and history that we can't really go into in great detail here, but just referencing some of them to reflect on as you kind of work through this material yourself and as we move forward. Right, this connects with, for example, the political idea of liberalism, right? And so when we're talking about liberalism in a sort of academic or political science sense, right, it's important to recognize this doesn't mean liberalism as in progressive contemporary politics or left wing politics, if you will, right? Liberalism in the classical sense is a reference to an approach to government, to politics, that really emphasizes as much individual freedom as possible. Right. So liberalism kind of traces its roots back to Enlightenment figures like John Locke, where the goal was really to free individuals from as many external constraints as possible. Right. So if you think about this sort of in historical terms, right, we in the Middle Ages, to kind of really oversimplify and stereotype things. Um, but an individual person was bound by all sorts of forces and organizations, right? There was the local church, there were the guilds that controlled certain trades, right? There were all these institutions, and so individual people were sort of locked into their roles by all of these social groups and forces. Um, right? And what liberalism seeks to do is to eliminate that as much as possible, right? So the goal of liberalism is to have sort of the autonomous individual who is really only constrained by a large scale state, right? So in modern terms, this would be the nation state. And so you can see this even in America, right? Our history, initially, there was a real emphasis on the states versus the federal government. And as sort of the liberal project has progressed, if you will, the role of the individual states has decreased over time to the point where most Americans really focus on themselves on an individual level and then the nation state, right? And now, again, this is obviously something people still contest. But if you just look at like political activity, the amount of attention that we focus, say, on a presidential race or election versus the amount of attention we give to a local election or even a state election uh, is radically different, right? We really focus all of our attention, or the vast majority of our culture's attention, on sort of just the national level and the individual, and we really pay minimal attention to anything in between. And again, this is sort of an outgrowth of this view of freedom, which emphasizes freedom as just a freedom from external constraints, right? And so the goal of increasing human freedom is achieved by eliminating as many possible constraints on our behavior as possible, right? And this even comes up um, more controversially for many of us in recent Supreme Court rulings, right? Where the Supreme Court has argued that really the essence of the American view of freedom is to be able to not only be not compelled by outside forces, but we have a freedom to define the meaning of life for ourselves, right? That we as individuals really exercise kind of ultimate autonomy, right? That we can determine um, how and to what ends we should live without any sort of external coercion whatsoever, right? And at a certain point, some people have begun to notice that this leads us to certain problems, right? That if we emphasize this kind of freedom to such an extreme, we ultimately lose the ability to produce any sort of consensus on how we ought to live, right? And that then ends up reducing much of our political discourse to just a battle of preferences, right? That there's no debate and deliberation on how we best achieve common goals because we've abandoned the idea of common goals, right? So all that we have is the individual preference that we then kind of assert against others' preferences in a way that descends into the sort of cultural and political conflict we find ourselves in today, right? So that political and cultural situation and those problems really are in many ways rooted in this understanding of the human person and the nature of freedom that he is talking about here in the chapter. Right, and obviously, he's arguing that this is not the proper, or at least not the full understanding of freedom in a Catholic sense. Right, that we would say a true freedom is a freedom to fulfill our nature. Right, that we are most free when we live well, when we live in a way that fits with the way we were made, and when we live in a way that helps us attain our true ultimate goal of flourishing and happiness in this life, excuse me, and in the next, right? That's what true freedom is. Now, again, this raises questions and problems and conflicts, right? Because this view of freedom depends on the ability to understand human nature and to understand what our proper end is, right? And those are obviously things that are certainly debated today. Um, it also kind of runs counter to the way that we are formed to think as American citizens, as American individualists, whether we like it or not. Right? It seems kind of weird to us to think that following the rules, if you will, actually makes you more free. But that is sort of the claim of natural law, right? Which I think, again, Waddell explains pretty well in the chapter. Um, and in many ways, it's helpful to kind of reflect on what do we think of as ourselves, or what do we think of as the essence of the individual. And that is obviously a very large, complicated philosophical and theological question. And we don't need to solve all that right now, but one of the claims of Catholic tradition of natural law is that we are more than certainly, and we are maybe distinct from some of our desires, right? And this is really where a lot of our cultural debate happens today, right? That for much of our society, right, really what it is to achieve personal fulfillment is to fulfill the desires that I feel this moment, right? That my goal is to fulfill my desires. At this moment, I desire this amount of money, this amount of pleasure, this way of living. And so, really, the goal of life is to fulfill those things. Whereas the natural law view is that um, our desires are distinct from and not necessarily in line with our true identity, our true nature as a person, right? And in fact, sometimes our desires make us less free, right? And we certainly recognize this even in the larger culture in some instances, right? So we recognize, for example, that people have addictions. They have a very strong desire for alcohol or for drugs or for pornography or whatever it is. Um, and that does in some way limit their ability to lead the life they really want to lead or ought to lead on some level. Um, but so what natural law does, of course, is to take that somewhat obvious insight and say, well, there's the similar thing that happens with basically with all of us, right? That there are many of our desires that we feel that are in fact distortions, right? That they are in fact corruptions of our nature or expressions of the corruption of our nature. And that we would be more free if we could control those desires and if we could ultimately get to the point where we desire more properly, right? And of course, that is, as we've been talking about for these past several weeks, that's what building virtue is all about. Is that over time, we can shape our habits, we can shape our desires in such a way that we want to do what is good, we naturally do what is good. And in that way, we are, in fact, much more truly free, right? So a person who is constrained by their vices, by bad desires, isn't as free to live well as the person who has trained their desires. I often use the example in classes of a piano, right? That I've never taken piano lessons. My children have for varying lengths of time and with varying degrees of success. Um, but they can all play piano pretty decently, or at least three of the four. Um, and so I have complete negative freedom when I sit down at a piano. There's nothing that constrains me from hitting the keys in any sort of a combination that I see fit to do. Um, but really, when I sit down at a piano, I am very limited in what I can do. Right? I can do the little Jaws thing, right? No, 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 no. That's about the limit of my freedom at a piano. Whereas my children, who have spent years following the rules, learning the habits, being formed by an instructor, when they sit down at a piano, they can do all sorts of things. They can play songs, they can play things they've memorized, they can just improvise and make things up, right? So they have a freedom at the piano that has been formed through years of practice, through following the rules, through developing these habits, whereas I don't have that same freedom, right? And the same sort of dynamic happens on the scale of our entire lives through the building of virtue or through not building virtue or building bad habits, right? That the latter limits our freedom, whereas the former actually expands our freedom, right? And you could pick whatever metaphor you want, sports or cooking or any sort of uh, human endeavor where you have to develop a certain amount of skill and discipline in order to do it well. Um, the claim of Catholic morality is that this is true in moral life as a whole. And you would think that this would be fairly obvious. But again, that negative view of freedom, that political liberalism in the classical sense, really has made it difficult for us as Americans, as modern Westerners, to properly appreciate that. Um, but again, I think that's important for us to reflect on as we move forward. And I think it is also worth recognizing that this is a really contested philosophical claim that lies at the heart of this, right? That um, what do we identify as the core of the human person is really important, right? And it has to be something that is just distinct from our desires, right? And so trying to figure out what that is trying to figure out what it means to be free um, is a great challenge, right? And to be fair to the critics of Christianity, right, they would argue, well, what we're doing is instead of being guided by, say, our desires, we're being guided by the church or by divine commands, right? So that we aren't really free either. Um, and here again, I think it's important to recognize the complexity of the issues, um, right? Because in a certain sense, right, this is true, right? A Christian view is going to say that human nature is defined by the Creator, right? That God defines how we ought to live, right? And that we then live in accord with this. And it, in fact, recognizes we don't have the kind of autonomy that sort of Enlightenment humanism would want us to have, right? Where the human person can define on their own what is the ultimate meaning of life, right? In fact, the meaning of life is dictated for us by the Creator, right? And so for many people, this is obviously going to seem to be a limitation. Um, the Christian response to that would be um, that is a limitation that's just part of reality, right? As finite contingent beings who are not responsible for our own existence in a fundamental sense, we are inevitably going to be constrained by something. We're either constrained by the wishes and design of a creator, or we are constrained by the accidental qualities that we come into existence having through a process of random physical reactions and biological evolution, right? In the humanist view of things, we don't get the freedom to define our own nature either. Our nature is shaped by the desires built into us through the results of cosmological processes, ultimately leading into biological evolution. And here we come into the world. We are still not self-defined in the way that the human person would ultimately like to be able to be. So part of adopting a Catholic conception of the human person, morality, and freedom is recognizing that that kind of ultimate self-determination is both not true and is simply impossible, right? And so that what we are left with is the choice of accepting our situation as finite contingent beings or rebelling against it, right? And so the natural law would say, no, we acknowledge it, we accept it, and that the best way to live in response to the reality we find ourselves in is in line with our nature and fulfilling the design that God has built into us. So that's a lot to kind of wrestle with on a really kind of big philosophical level. Um, and Waddell talks about it, I think, pretty well, but I just wanted to prompt us to reflect on it a little bit further. The last thing I wanted to add uh, is, again, something that has come up in previous modules, but I think it's helpful to reflect on here in this chapter. Is in the discussions, and I think in some earlier videos and modules, we've talked about consumerism, right? And another aspect of modern American life, that we really tend to define ourselves largely as consumers, as people who buy certain things, buy certain experiences or goods. And our culture is really focused on the acquisition of goods and services that then kind of define our success or lack thereof in life. This is obviously something that recent popes and other Catholic figures have argued very much against, but it is certainly a major force in our society. And I think it's important for us to reflect on as we think about freedom and how our freedom is constrained in different ways, how much consumerism really shapes our conception of who we are as people and what it is that we ought to do, right? And I think that this happens in ways that most of us are not really uh, critically reflecting on with any sufficient degree of intensity. And that our choices are shaped in countless ways that mostly lie simply beyond our perception, right? I mean, most obvious example of this is smartphones and social media, which are not just consumer goods. They are, in fact, a very highly sophisticated methods for influencing our behavior. And they influence our behavior again, in ways that most of us don't really reflect on that often. Modern advertising and modern products like processed foods, for example, are very carefully designed in order to shift our behavior and our consumption in ways that we see as being freely chosen, but are in fact the result of thousands and thousands of hours of research and billions of dollars in advertising and product development meant to coerce our behavior in ways that are advantageous to certain companies, certain investors, what have you. And right, I think when we think about consumerism, it's important to realize that this isn't just sort of an individual moral issue, right? It's not just about me as a person being a little too focused on buying stuff, and I need to kind of shift my priorities a bit. That consumerism, like some of the other isms we've been talking about here in this module, is a vast sort of cultural, social reality, right? And that it is not something that we can escape just by deciding, oh, I'm going to save a little bit more of my paycheck. I'm going to buy a few less frivolous things, right? That consumerism really shapes our world and our choices and our way of thinking in some very profound and very systematic and subtle ways. Uh, so again, I think this is something to reflect on more, to research more. We can't really address it in all the detail it should receive here in this module. We will come back to this in upcoming weeks, and we will also come back to this in other courses. But again, thinking about how our behavior is shaped, um, it's really important to recognize that it's not just about an individual and the temptations that we think of ourselves as struggling with, that we are part of social systems that shape our behavior in all sorts of ways, much of which we are unconscious of. And so part of the point of education and formation and sort of theology and moral theology and philosophy is getting ourselves to step back and sort of critically reflect on how all of this works. So again, I would encourage you as you go through the coming weeks and as you kind of go through the coming years to reflect on that a little bit more and think about how this shapes our behavior and how we as Catholics or just as good moral people might in fact work to get some of that true freedom, that true flourishing to be a larger component of our lives and choices. So, those are some kind of big topic things to think about as we move ahead. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this chapter and those ideas in our discussions.